All right, we should be live and good to go. Gonna wait and get some confirmation. Sweet. Awesome. What's up, everyone? Welcome to another round of Tuneful Tuesday. My name is Neil Erickson here at EDM Tips, and I'm here to guide you through some feedback on track submissions for members of our Radio Ready program and the EDM Tips Accelerator. So, for the next hour, all we're going to be doing is going through track submissions of works in progress, finished tracks from members of our community, and I'll be providing my feedback right here on the spot. Now, if you're tuning in for the first time and you're interested in getting feedback on some of your tracks, all you need to do is be enrolled in either the EDM Tips Accelerator or the Radio Ready program. You can learn more about that via the link below in the description of this video. And if you've ever got any questions or are interested in setting up a time to chat with one of us just to see if it'd be a good fit, please do feel free to reach out to one of us at EDM Tips, or if you go through that link below and fill out the form, you'll be, guided to set up a welcome call and an introduction call right on the spot. So guys, with that, we're going to go ahead and, as Mint Puma said, get this party started. I'm going to share my screen, and we've got a lot of submissions to get through today, so I'm going to hop straight into it. Let's see what we've got this week for Tuneful Tuesday. So up first, I've got a track submission coming from Nima out of our Accelerator program. And this was kind of a missed call or a missed submission from last week. We didn't quite have enough time. But since he submitted, I figured we'd give him a little bit of feedback. So he's looking just, I think, for general feedback on So We're Lost. So let's check out and see what we've got here.
They wanna find us,
as usual, guys, as I get started, if you could just confirm for me that the volume levels between my voice and what you guys are hearing are at an appropriate level, that'd be great.
the world and what their lights. But we hide in shadows like moths. They try to pin us for our thoughts.
Great sense of texture to start this track out.
They want to buy a polar mind space. But when they look quick disappear.
So a really good sense of space. The vocal is cutting through really nice and clearly. You've got two options for the way I would approach this intro. Right now, what you've got is you've got a decent balance of body, mid-tonal elements, and then high-end atmosphere in your synthesis layers. What we're missing is connection with the vocal. So the vocal right now sounds just a little bit thin compared to everything else. So like I said, you have two options. You could either add a little bit more low end back into the vocal, really like that 100 to 400 hertz range is what's missing there. Or you could keep that vocal nice and light and take away some of the emphasis on the bassier layers of the synths. And that way the entire track will come in as this kind of like nice and light start, and then you can come in with a little bit more weight in the vocal and the bass later on in the track. So entirely up to you how you want to manage that. Those are your options. Ooh, really cool little tonal mess around there. I heard a little bit of delay on that. I want a little bit more delay on this, so that kind of continues to echo on for a little bit longer into that transition. Cool. At this point, I would call this like the drop, so to speak, because we had this nice little tension building moment, and then we're getting again back into the meat with the kick. So a couple of things that I want here is a little bit more volume on the kick, particularly in the top end to give us a little bit more airiness on it. Past that, I'd also love a little bit more weight on the bass and a little bit more drive and top end presence on your main lead that came in there just before the vocal. Some coloring EQ, some opening of the filter should do the trick for that fluff lead. All right, and Nima, hopefully that all helps. Great tune so far. Like I said earlier, phenomenal sense of space and atmosphere. Great sound selection. Let's give it up for Nima with So We're Lost. Up next, I've got a track submission coming from... Well, okay, so let me preface this. Ruben, I saw that you submitted, the little form. I'm missing an actual link from you via that form. So, Ruben, if you're watching this and you want some feedback on your track, please feel free to resubmit. And just make sure you include the link as well as the kind of comments there. All right, so up next, we've officially got a track from Sean coming out of our Radio Ready program saying, I would really like some advice on the mixing and mastering side of things. I'm struggling with it. Thanks. Cool, yeah, let's see what we've got with 2 hours. Good sense of space, good start. I like the percussion elements that you've chosen. Now, right from the start, the first notes that came in threw me off a little bit because the kick has a decent amount of tonality to it. So I expected a certain key to be played. I'm not always going to advocate for tuning your kick. I think it's great in some genres. Some genres it's not necessarily important to do. In this particular case, I would recommend tuning your kick to the root of your track just to really set the stage for what the tonality of this track is going to end up being, because you are starting with the root of that kick. Awesome start right here. So I'd love a little bit more thickness and saturation on the bass line in particular, mostly in the low mids. I think the top end is going to just end up competing against the lead if you boost that up too much, but focus on getting a little bit more body on that bass line. A little bit of delay on either this main ARP lead or the bass line, or maybe just a faint touch of both would be nice to help just kind of increase a little bit more of the rhythm and energy of the track. Cool. I like that new layer that you have kind of on the sides. The risk with it is that it's become a little bit too loud. Now this could be the result of your mastering, any kind of compression and limiting that's pushing our dynamic range a little bit closer. So you've got a couple of options there. If it is a result of the master and it doesn't sound like this quite in the mix, then I would just dial back the amount of compression and limiting, or go back into the mix and dial back the volume of this kind of wide swell layer just a little bit. You were looking for some advice on the mix as well, or the master as well. To be honest, your master sounds quite well balanced as a whole. Just make those couple of changes to the mix down that I suggested, and you should be in a really good spot. All right, so let's give it up for Sean there. Up next, we've got a track from Yaniv coming out of our Accelerator program. He's saying, looking for feedback on the break and drop at around 220. So let's see what we got here from In This Life. Great piano tone here. Currently the piano is weighted off to the left side. I think because it's the only thing playing at this moment, it'll probably be better if you get that evenly weighted on both sides, or maybe save some of the lower notes for the left side but the higher notes for the right side. Either way, we want to make sure that that piano's sitting nice and even on both the left and right. Great sampler sound selection, great vibe going on here. The one thing that I'm noticing is that we don't have a really clearly defined dynamic range or a front to back space in the mix. Currently everything is kind of sitting somewhat in the medium back of the mix, except for maybe the vocal. So what I would focus on doing is bringing a little bit more presence to your ARP synth layer in there, and then also probably the vocal just a little bit. So right here, I'm facing kind of a similar problem where I don't have a very clearly defined dynamic range, but I think in this case, it's more so because everything has a little bit too much presence of the reverb and the pads. So what I would do is I would focus on bringing up a little bit more bite and top end energy with the coloring EQ boost to your drum kit. And then past that, maybe dial back the pads and atmospheres just a little bit. And then finally, the kick is in a pretty good spot right now. I think the low end could come up just a little bit more. And when I say low end, I really mean the information below 100 hertz, because we actually have a decent amount of presence in the 100 to 500 hertz range on that kick. So just bring up the sub end of that kick a little bit, and then definitely bring up the bass layers a decent amount, because we get a lot more weight in those. On my subwoofer, I'm not quite really feeling the sub bass, but I am feeling the kick a decent amount. Cool. All right, otherwise fantastic vibe here. Again, great groove, great sound selection, good composition there. Let's give it up for Yaniv. So up next, we've got a track submission coming from Brahm out of our EDM Tips Accelerator. He's saying, "Hi, I got my mixing done, and I'm curious towards your feedback before going to master it. Also towards my radio mix. Oh, I see. So, Brom, I'd say, if you're looking for feedback on both mixes, just submit them week after week. We try to limit this to just one track submission per person per week, even if it is like variations on the same track, just to keep it fair, and, keep things moving along. You're saying the only difference between those two is the beginning. The second drop is shortened, and the ending, the rest is the same as the extended. Okay, cool. Well, then, since you're looking for mixed feedback, we'll just kind of dive into the extended version and just make sure that that works out okay. Check like the initial moments, and then I'll probably skip ahead into the meat of the track from there. So far, nice open sense of space. Good start here. Groove on this is fantastic. I think I'd like just a tiny bit more body on the claps. In context to the weight of the bass that we're getting, and then that really nice airy hit of the hi-hats, the claps aren't quite fulfilling their own independent purpose. Like, they have a little bit too much of that top end overlapping with the lower part of the hi-hat, and not quite enough of that like mid-range 200 to 1200 hertz body in the or in the clap. So maybe boost up that mid-range just a little bit with a coloring EQ, and that should help give us a little bit more thickness. Lead is sounding great.
When house came in, they had that thing that we seem to have lost. We got caught up in the commerciality of it, but people, they don't really care how you make it. They just
So there's nothing wrong with this section right now. The vocal's super clear. I'm hearing the hi-hats really nicely. But to add a little bit more interest, it might be worth playing with a bandpass filter sweep on your hi-hats and your percussion. Just bringing down the energy a little bit of those as the vocal comes in, and then maybe bringing it back up as we get to this build.
Different forms.
Great kick and bass relationship going on here. That very distant like ride cymbal that you had just play right there is just a little bit too quiet. I've got a feeling, to be honest, that it's going to come up in the mastering stage. So chuck a limiter on your mix, just do a quick test and see if it ends up loud enough after some limiting. Otherwise, in the mixdown, bring that volume up just a little bit. All right, let's give it up for Brom there with house music. Up next, we've got a track submission from Steve Smith coming out of our Accelerator program as well. Then, hey Neil, could you go from about 155 to 315 and then 350 and through until time permits, please? Looking for any comments on the transitions, mixing, and any general pointers for improvement. Thank you. Yeah, let's see what we got. So 155 about. Great groove to start. So, Steve, one thing you might want to look out for is how present and dominant this kick is in the low mids, like the 100 to 500 hertz range. It's really drawing my ear to that, and a decent amount of presence on that kick drum. But the hi-hats and the snares, like all of the other percussion layers, seem to be a little bit more distant in the mix. And this could be because of sample selection. It could be because of some reverb that's either baked into the sample or that you've applied on. So I would just go in and I would make all of your drums a little bit drier if you can, or focus on de-emphasizing that kick drum a decent amount. That vocal drop is fantastic right here, though. Maybe a tiny bit of like a reverb or delay throw as the vocal chop cuts out to just help them transition into this new section would be nice. Love the textures in this break here. And Then you wanted me to skip ahead to 350 until time permits. So let's see what we got going on there. So in this section, as you're kind of filtering everything up and opening up the energy, I would recommend a bandpass on the kick to be doing the same. And you can just kind of extend the length of that, or the kind of range of that bandpass over time. So it's not necessarily just sweeping in a tight range, but it's more so starting from a contained area and then opening up slowly from there. That'll help just build a little bit more tension, anticipation, and make the kick a little bit more impactful at the drop itself. If you want to make this a little bit dancier, it might also be worth adding a tiny bit of like mid to upper high coloring EQ boost to the snare drum to give it just a little bit more brightness and lift to it. But that's, again, only if you want to make this more dancey. If you want to keep it relatively chill and low key, it might actually be worth tightening up the snare a little bit by shortening the tail end of it. It's a little bit splashy right now, and it's sitting kind of in the middle between those two vibes of that slightly more chill and that slightly more energetic dance. Awesome. Final thing I'd love to see is just a little bit more stereo separation in the synth layers. Now, you do a good job of keeping that space open for the vocals on the far sides, but otherwise we've got a little bit of a gap from the center where all of our synths and a lot of the drums are to the far sides where the vocals are. So it's this kind of like middle area that I want to be filled in a little bit more. All right. Otherwise, though, fantastic work on this track. Great groove, great vibe as always. So let's give it up for Steve there. Up next, I've got a track submission from Mickey coming out of our Radio Ready program. And he's just looking for some general feedback. So let's see what we got with Feeling the Love. Fantastic start. Good use of those little flourishes and everything. I like that they fade out relatively quickly so we can get back to focusing on the bass line. That little cowbell and your percussion are just really, really sitting nicely in the mix. The snare drum fill that came in there was a little bit too much mid-range, not quite enough high-end. One thing I'm noticing about this piano, the tonality of it's fantastic, but the notes are lasting just a little bit too long. So we're not quite getting the same degree of bouncy separation in that layer that we're getting in the rest of the mix. So I would just go in and I'd shorten up your MIDI notes or shorten up the release and tail end of that piano sample, and you should be in a great spot. There is a little bit of mud and conflict going on in the low end. I think it's coming from the bass line versus the lower notes of the piano. So shortening up the piano will help out a decent amount here. It might also be worth setting up some dynamic EQ sidechain between those two so that anytime the bass line is playing, we don't necessarily need that full weight in the low end of the piano. Jono suggesting some more sidechain in the chat, and I would agree, more sidechain on that piano would be great. Your bass line sounding really great. I can hear the top end of the kick cutting through the mix a little bit because it's got a decent amount of presence on that top end. I'm not getting the low end to drive and weight on the kick cutting. I would suggest a little bit of extra volume on the kick in general, but particularly a low end EQ boost so that kick helps bring that thump out a little further. Ooh, love that little guitar solo or electric piano or whatever that might be. So in this moment, because the guitar or that lead is playing off to the left side, it might be worth just moving the vocals a little bit further to the right. They feel just a tiny bit weighted to the left as well, so we're trading off melodies on the left side, and the right side of our mix is just a little bit open as a result. All right, fantastic vibe, groove, and composition otherwise, so let's give it up for Mickey there coming out of our Radio Ready program. Up next, we've got a track coming from Gordon out of our Radio Ready program. That's Mr. G to mention, saying, "Hey Neil, I made this track in 2 days. Not sure if the drop is big enough. Just some general feedback on the track would be appreciated. Thanks. Yeah, let's see what we got here. Gordon with Get Down. Good start. So since you're starting with like this more atmospheric approach, I would recommend some extra reverb on the synth layer that's playing there. That'll help give us a little bit of extra space and fill out the mix just a little bit further. I do think the drums could use just a little bit more lift to them, so like an EQ boost above 1 kilohertz across the drum group, and relatively subtle of an EQ boost, but a little bit in there is going to help just bring some life to those drums.
It's time to get down, time to be free.
Bass is in a pretty good spot. The kick is close, but I do think the kick could be just a touch louder in the mix. Cool. I like the sound that you used for that little melodic riff there. To make that a little bit stronger, I would recommend just playing off of a single motif and repeating a few more notes, as opposed to just kind of evolving that melody throughout the entire time. The reason for that is, with that evolved melody, it makes it just a little bit tough to track and remember after hearing only
Time
once.
to be free. Release yourself, let your spirit be. It's time to get down.
Love the vocal sample here. One thing I would like to hear on this vocal sample is a little bit more reverb and delay to help fill out that space and again lean into that atmospheric vibe.
Time to be free. Release yourself, let your spirit be. It's time to get down.
Cool, so heading into that drop, I'd like to hear you take out a little bit more of the low end. Kind of like you did some sort of like low end removal by taking a bit from the bass. An auto filter sweep that cuts away a little bit more of those mid-range elements would be really nice heading into that build.
It's time to get down, time to be free. Release yourself, let your spirit
But
be.
also like a little bit more side chaining on the bass. I feel like it's just staying a little bit too
Be
consistent.
free. Release yourself, let your spirit be.
Every once in a while it has like a fantastic pump to it, but it's not consistent every single time that kick, it seems. Awesome. All right, well, let's give it up for Gordon with Get Down. Again, guys, great vibe, good groove, good rhythm going on in that track. Excuse me. Up next, we've got a track submission coming from Maxwell out of our out of our Accelerator program, saying Happy Tuesday on a melodic house streak and continued with the genre, looking for overall feedback and vibe of the track. Only creative processing is done, no EQ or compression. This is the first half of the song, so if time permits, please play from the beginning to the end as it's only 3 minutes and contains the overall theme. Still working on the breakdown of the second half of the song. Many thanks. Cool, yeah, let's see what we got with the one. Cool, so really nice atmosphere that's going on here. I do think that this intro section would benefit from just one more layer of like Foley or something else to add a little bit of ear candy, movement, and texture. One thing I'm noticing is that the groove of your pulsing between the kick and the bass here doesn't quite match the feeling of the groove between the kick and the hi-hats. The kick and the bass is a little bit more laid back, there's some extra space between them, but those hi-hats are hitting kind of right away on those offbeats, and it creates a little bit more of a rushed feel there. Neither one of them is better than the other, but I would say pick one, whichever one, one of those two layers you prefer the groove of, and then try to match the feel of the bounce in the other layer. Great composition here. One thing I'd look out for as you kind of approach the mix is creating a little bit more space and separation in some of these elements. So, for example, on the chords that kind of echo out a little bit more, maybe have them come in a little bit louder at first, and then allow that to swell back. So we get this like nice kind of pulse of the mix forward, and then that energy recedes afterwards with the delay. Another thing to look out for is going to be some stereo separation in the mid-range. I noticed this new kind of R player that's coming in is sitting in the center on top of our bass and our kick, and now the vocal's going to be in there competing for it. That R player would just naturally sound great with some width to it, so just try spreading that out nice and line. The other thing I'd focus on is adding a little bit more presence to that vocal. It is just a little bit lost and distant in the mix right now. So bringing out some of that 1K to 7K range in the vocal would be great. Maybe dialing back the reverb on it or just sidechaining the reverb against the vocal itself. Awesome. All right, well, fantastic work with this one, Maxwell. Great vibe, great sound selection. I think the big thing, like I said, is just focus on creating more separation among the mix, both in the stereo field and that front to back depth field. All right, up next, what do we have? We've got a track coming from Shrikant coming out of our Accelerator program. He's saying, I'm just looking for feedback on the master. Maybe you could jump quickly through the sections and share your thoughts if it's not a big ask. Certainly not. So let's see what we've got. I know we've got like an 8-minute track, so yeah, I'll jump around through these sections and just kind of make sure that the master is working out. Good start, good balance, good sense of space here. Yeah, no complaints on that. So one thing I'm kind of noticing here is your percussion sounds fantastic. Right up front, really crisp and clear. I think the synths in comparison have a little bit too much wetness of reverb on them. And this is pretty natural to have during the mastering stages for that reverb and atmosphere to come up. So I would just dial back that reverb and atmosphere just a touch in the low mid range in particular. Good sense of movement here. In a similar vein, we've lost a little bit of the pumping that you used to have in this track. So I still hear the pump from a mixing perspective. That kick is nice and clear, but because of the compression and limiting that happens during the mastering stage, the amount of separation between the kick drum and that pump back up to the bass has got to decrease just a little bit in order to make this affected ever so slightly. So it might be worth connecting the mix down and increasing the length of that pump just ever so slightly more across the track. Build is sounding great right now. Cool. So one thing that I've noticed is that this build built up a lot of energy, and it wasn't quite matched, particularly in like the upper mid range between the build and the drop. My guess is again coming back to the limiting compression. This area just got brought up a little too much, whereas this area is going to be limited by, the kick drum and the volume of the bass. So I would just decrease the volume and amount of swelling in that build ever so slightly so the drop maintains its extra power. Let's check one last section here. Cool. Final thing here. The thump of the kick is in a great spot. The sub bass doesn't quite seem as present and weighty as I'd like, so consider just bringing up the sub bass itself just a little bit. All right, let's give it up for Shrikant. That's Mr. Mani here out of our Accelerator program. Up next, we've got a track submission from Mr. Paul Evans coming out of our Accelerator as well. Looking for just some general feedback, reaction, and improvements. Yeah, let's see what we've got with Quan. fantastic groove and sense of space here. I like how short all of your elements are, because despite them all being relatively present, we still have a great sense of depth in the empty space in between each hit.
That's your work? Oh yeah, that's my work.
So I love the width on the bass, particularly in the top end. I do think we're running into just a little bit of phasing in the low mids from the bass, so I would apply the ozone imager on there just to tighten up the information below like 500 hertz a little bit, and then leave the information above 500 hertz nice and wide. So right in this moment, this like sequencer synth layer is just a little bit lost in the mix. And I think it's because of how, thick and full your percussion. The top end layers of the synth aren't quite able to cut through. So it might be worth just saturating and driving that synth a little bit further, and then maybe setting up some dynamic side chains between that and your percussion. So that anytime that sequencer layer pulls through, the very low end body of the percussion just takes a tiny, tiny step back to allow the synth to
What is love?
Another thing that might help is on like some of those synth fills every once in a while, spread those super wide as well, just because your percussion is mostly living in the center, so if the more we get to the sides, the more space that percussion is going to
That's your work.
All right. Fantastic work, though. Really great groove. Again, really great sense of space there. Let's give it up for Paul with Quan. Up next, we've got a track submission coming from Aviral out of our Accelerator program, saying, would be grateful for a general overview of the mixdown done on this track. It has not been mastered. Thanks. Yeah, let's see what we got with Pilgrim's mix. Good start here, good sense of atmosphere and space. I think I'd love for you to bring up that percussion layer that's on the side just a touch in volume. It is just ever so slightly lost to the atmospheres. Little moment of tension there. That bass line didn't quite align with the notes and the feeling of the harp, but in a good way. However, I would like for that little stab to last a little longer. It felt like it faded out a bit too quickly. Consider reducing the volume of this pad just a little bit. It's starting to swallow up the drums as a whole. And I would say it ended up building up a little bit too much energy for what we're getting out of this, drop-like section, so to speak. Fantastic job with the kick and bass relationship. That's sounding and feeling really nice. Synth plug sounds fantastic. Yeah, I love the movement on that, just the panning that you've got going on in there. The tonality and the balance of that synth is right where it needs to be. Again, I think these pad-like swells are just doing up a little bit too much in volume. And then the final thing I look out for is just drive a little bit more energy into the drum kit through some parallel compression. I think that'll help bring up some of the tail ends, bring up a little bit more brightness and thickness in the drums as well. All right, let's give it up for Aviral. Fantastic work with that. Really great vibe. Again, those synths were just absolutely spot on. All right, let's see what we got going on up next. We've got a track from Diego coming out of our Accelerator program. Looking for just some general advice. The beginning at around 110 to not take too long during the Tuneful Tuesday, and also 225 to 3. the break until 5:35 if you have time to cover. As you recommended before, I'm working on multiple tracks not to get bored. All right, cool. Yeah, let's see what we got, and we'll jump around a little bit here. Volume. Cool, and let's jump up to the 110 mark. Cool, great sense of space. Love the motion on the pad and those hi-hats. The kick drum is just a little bit heavy in the kind of like very low mid end around that 80 to like 140 hertz range. I'm just getting just a little bit of headroom buildup. The low end thump is in a pretty good spot, so what I would recommend doing is just a slight EQ dip in that 80 to 140 hertz range, and that should clean up a little bit of headroom for the rest of the mix. Let's jump ahead to like that 225 area. I'd love a little bit more presence on this like synth blip that you have kind of coming around the sides, or this like sequencer like layer. Bring it up a little bit in volume saturation, and then bring out some top end energy to it with either some high end coloring EQ or a tool like Fresh Air by Slate Digital. Now, what that'll probably end up doing is those like occasional synth swells that you have would then get masked. So I would set up some sidechain compression on your sequencer or ARP-like layer against these swells, so that anytime those swells come up, that ARP layer just takes a half step back, and then it can come back up in the space in between. Let's check the break until about 5:35. Here. Cool. I love the texture of this synth. There's a little bit of muddiness coming up. I think we have too many low-end notes playing together. So in that chord that you've got built out, I would take out some of those low-end notes and either just remove them altogether or pitch them up an octave or two so that we get a little bit more clarity in the low mid. Right there, you had this like brighter sequencer layer that was playing just a second ago. Rather than just kind of stopping it, I would fade that out more steadily throughout this section. Yeah, and that'll help, really bring the energy down leading up to this point where the kick comes back in. We start to bring that energy right back up. All right, let's give it up for Diego. That's Casanova with Project 10 or 101. Up next, we've got a track submission coming from Rajesh, coming out of our Radio Ready program. Looking for feedback on the mix down. Yeah, Rajesh, so let's see what we got with Pureza. The percussion sound fantastic. They might just be a little bit loud compared to the other elements in the mix. So depending on where your headroom lies, I'd either bring the percussion down or bring the other elements in the mix up just a little bit. Might be worth trying to add a little bit more body to that piano with like a low mid EQ boost, help add a little bit of weight. Cool, so right here, I think it's just got a little bit too much going on. So the vocal gets introduced as well as that ARP right around the same time. I think just stick to one of those layers. And that'll help set us up for the verse a little bit better when they are both playing. By that point, by having only one of them play to begin with, we'll kind of prepare the listener for the combination of the two without, overwhelming them with too much information. Whole little break area sounds fantastic. nudge that back to the right a little bit. That'll help create a little bit more of a swung feel to this track. Good kick and bass relationships going on down there. You have this like mid-range, like tube-like bass layer. It's carrying a lot of good rhythm and it's a lot of good tonality to it. So I would suggest just bringing it up a little bit in the mix, allowing that pattern to cut through a little bit more heavily. Awesome vibe, really cool take on this. Or I shouldn't say take on this track. It's a really cool idea. I like the kind of combination of the drum pattern and then a little bit more of the atmospheric feel that you've got to the rest of it. All right, up next, we've got a track submission coming from Renee out of our Accelerator program. Saying, hi Neil, hi guys, this is my first submission for Tuneful Tuesday. Welcome aboard to these track feedbacks, Renee. And you're saying a judgment of the bass frequencies would be great. Also, an overall feedback would be much appreciated. Thank you very much in advance. Sure thing, let's see what we've got with Only You. Cool, really cool percussion. The very first thing I'm noticing is that this percussion could use a little bit more of a high-end coloring EQ lift to drive some extra energy into the track. You've also got this like wide pulsing, like almost heartbeat-like sound. It's just a little bit too heavy compared to those drums right now. Just a touch less volume on that should do the trick. Or like I said, just more volume across the drums would also bring that balance closer together. Really cool drive and groove and energy here. I want just a tiny bit more side chaining on your various layers against the kick to help give us even more of that pulsing, pumping feel. Yeah, I think the drums are just a little bit too quiet. I'm not quite feeling the thump of the kick that I want to on the sub either. So just bring up the drum kit as a whole and you should be in a much better spot. I love this melody that's kind of trickling in. Give me a little bit of width on that sound design, that particular lead, and then fill it out a little bit more with some saturation and maybe some mid-range coloring EQ, and that should really help give it its own space and sense of body in the mix. Currently, it's just ever so slightly overlapping with the lower parts of the percussion. Some sort of like transition effects, like crash cymbal, a very faint one, or even like a white noise downlifter at the start of the drop would really help out with that transition. If you're looking for feedback on the bass frequencies, I think they all sound very clean. They're just lacking a little bit of power, so I would just bring up the low end of your mix a decent amount in volume. Does sound a little bit better here. So at this point, the low mids are actually in a pretty good spot. It's just the sub end. So really the sub bass and the kick that need to come up. All right. Well, let's give it up for Renee with Only You. Fantastic, fantastic vibe and groove again. Up next, we've got a track submission coming from Parsona out of our Radio Ready program. Looking for feedback on mainly if the groove works if the build and drops work. Yeah, so let's see what we got with Dub into Club. Cool. Good sense of space in the top end. I think this like pulsing bass like layer that you've got just has a tiny bit too much information in like the 80 to 160 hertz range. I'm getting just a little bit of headroom buildup from that. So a small EQ cut in that range on that bass would do the trick. So I like this like tonal boop, boop sort of layer that's kind of playing off to the right. I would like to bring out a little bit more of the airiness and top frequencies of that, because you already have a decently full low mid-range and mid-range. So just use an EQ to kind of shift and boost up the highs a little bit more in that tonal layer, and then you might want to take down a little bit of that mid-range as well with a very subtle EQ dip, but start with the boost and see how you feel from there. Then you're looking for feedback on the build and drop, so let's check that section out in particular. Tiny little bit of Foley or percussion layer in there would help keep the motion up. I think the texture of your pad was fantastic, but I did just like fall into a little bit of a lull groove-wise at that moment. Cool. As a whole, things are sounding pretty good here. I would like a little bit more presence on the drums. And then I think a little bit more side chaining on the pads and atmospheres like layers against the kick, and maybe just reducing the volume of those pads and atmospheres ever so slightly. I feel like they're just swallowing up the mix just a tiny bit in comparison to what they need to be doing. All right, let's give it up for Parsona with Dub in the Club. Up next, we've got a track submission from Mr. Jeff Wyckoff coming out of our Accelerator program. And he is saying, "Hey Neil, would love for you to hear this whole track as it is my first time using an analog synth. Important parts are the intro through the first drop, 140 through the second, and 3 through the last. And around the 320 mark, I have background vocals that are supposed to complement the lead and be on the sides, but I can't figure out how to do that without making them sound very masked. Currently using mid-side EQ where I cut above 1K for the mids and then keep those frequencies on the sides. Hope you enjoy and thank you." Yeah, let's see what we got going on here, Jeff. Cool. Really cool sound to start. It'd be great if that synth sound that started out the track were really nice and wide. We've got the space for it, and you're using that space with these little effects layers anyways, so you might as well just make that synth sound a little bit fuller with some extra width. If you can't do it in the synth itself, then I would recommend using the wider plugin, but try starting by adding some extra unison voices and relying on the width directly from the synth. My first thoughts on this drop, really cool textures, really cool vibe, but there's a little bit too much going on. So that's the tricky thing, right? When we've got really interesting synth textures, we want to highlight them all, but the average listener really only has the ability to focus on like 1 or 2 at any given point. So I would just take out 1 or 2 of those layers and then just focus on beefing up and using what you've got in those existing. The other thing I'm noticing about this drop is that we've got a little bit of looseness in the drum groove. Every once in a while I'm hearing some double hits and some slammy textures, and it's not quite tight and synced up. Yeah, zoom in, see if you can use the same groove on them or just manually adjust and warp them so they're really hitting each other. Alright, let's check out like that 140 second drop. Love that vocal delay through there, that sounds really nice. Same sort of thing, I think there's just a little too much going on. At this point I would probably de-emphasize the effects just a little bit. Another thing that'll help out a decent amount with the track is just upping the amount of side chaining going on these synths against the kick. Currently the kick is just a little bit lost across the mix, and we'd also add a nice sense of pumping groove with that extra side chain. Alright, and then let's just check out that 320 section really quickly. So I think the biggest issue here is this lead that's come in versus the vocals. The lead is also nice and wide, so they're fighting a little bit for that sense of space inside. So if you're going to spread those vocals super wide at this point, I would put that lead right in the center. I'll also call out the notes of that lead don't quite seem to be interacting properly with the notes of your vocal in the track. So maybe rework the notes of that lead, get them to gel just a little bit better. All right, fantastic vibe, fantastic start to this one. I think once you clean that up a little bit, this is going to be a really, really killer track. But start by removing some of those elements and then fitting everything into their own kind of space in the stereo field. All right, let's give it up for Hefe there with Tomorrow Is Not Today. Up next, we've got a track submission coming from Matt's out of our Accelerator program. Then, hey Neil, I recorded my brother-in-law teaching my 5-year-old on how to play the trumpet. Pure talent right there. Absolutely love it. So I got inspired and put together a really raw idea. My thought is to hunt for kids talking and laughing to put in the break, and perhaps some sort of lead on top during the drop section. Any feedback on how to take it further into a full track is appreciated. As always, big thanks and have a great day. Thanks, Mats. All right, yeah, let's see what we got with trumpet guys. I love this. This is awesome. So there was a little bit too much reverb baked into that recording, so if you've got like a D-reverb tool that you can use, that'd be great. Otherwise, I would just try to saturate and add some mid-range coloring EQ to help create the perception of a little bit more body in that reverb. Love that war horn. This is a cool flip for sure. I think you could probably get a little bit more power from the sub bass and just a tiny bit less from the mid bass. Cool. All right, this is fantastic. Really great groove, really great vibe, good sound selection. Couple of things that I'd focus on as, for what to do next. I would bring up the energy of your drums and percussion just a little bit further, particularly like in any fill moments. Saturate those, add some high-end coloring EQ boost, and bring those right to the front. The other thing is, I loved that introduction, like with the trumpet, right? Like that very clearly, like kid learning to play the trumpet sort of vibe. I want to hear that sample and that sound come back later on in this track. Like perhaps at some point in the drop, start using that trumpet fill. Like you said, you were thinking of adding a lead in the drop. If you can turn one of those hits into some sort of lead that you can play around with, that'll bring this track full circle and it'll be the perfect result. Past that, in terms of expanding out the broader arrangement, I think you could just go straight back into a breakdown from this section. Again, play off of this initial trumpet sample as much as you can because that's adding this really goofy but fun vibe to the track. All right, let's give it up for Matt's there. Fantastic work. Let's see. Up next, we've got a track coming from Mr. John O'Hado out of our Radio Ready program. And he's saying, this is for the Armada Remix competition. If unable to play, I understand, but if you can, I'm looking for general feedback. I think the overall track has everything it needs, so any mixing tips would be appreciated. Jono, I do apologize, but we cannot play remixes on here just because we don't necessarily have rights to those. The one exception will be is if this is completely public and those stems are 100% available and they've given you permission to upload this track to public places. If that's the case, please let me know. I see that you're in the chat. So if you give me the, go ahead and say that, hey, this remix is public, the stems are public, they've given us permission to upload it elsewhere, then I can go ahead and play it. Otherwise, I am going to need to hold off on it. So I'll sit tight on it for just a second. I'll wait until I hear from you in the chat. And for now, we'll go ahead and just kind of move ahead, but I'll keep it open. So up next, we're going to go ahead and jump to a track from Mr. Dan Westlake, coming out of our Radio Ready program. And he's saying, does the bass have the right depth and volume in relation to the track's other elements? The bass first drops at 58 seconds, and the most busy part starts at 4:27. Yeah, let's see what we got here, Dan. Let's go ahead and jump a little bit up to the 58-second mark, maybe a bit sooner. Cool. Jono, I see your responses in the chat. If you want to try to check the contest rules and everything else of the sorts and get back to me. Otherwise, if you're not sure and it is only via label radar, I might have to hold off. Dan, I'd say this bass line's sitting in a really good spot right now. The highest notes of the bass line, interestingly enough, are giving me a little bit more relative weight on my subwoofer than some of the lowest ones. So just on those highest notes, maybe just reduce that low end just a little bit with some automation. Everything else was sitting really nicely balanced against the kick, but those couple of high notes are overtaking the kick just ever so slightly. Fantastic use of space, vibe, reverb, everything else is working fantastically there. Let's head ahead to that most busy part of the track, because quite frankly, I don't have too much that I would change about that initial section. Okay, right here, these side chords are just a little bit too present and are overtaking our attention of the vocal just ever so slightly. So I would just dial back the volume of those side chords just a couple dB. You know what, the bass might be eating up just a tiny bit too much headroom at this point. So as soon as the vocal cuts out, it's actually fine, but when the vocal is playing there, it is taking away a little bit of our sense of space and depth, taking away from that clarity in the vocal. So at least while the vocal is playing, I would recommend just a small EQ dip at around like 80 to, again, 160 hertz or so in that bass line, and that should help out. One other thing you could probably do here, just to give you some extra feedback, because this track really is in a nicely polished state, bring up the atmospheres a little bit at this point once the rest of the synths have fallen out. So we no longer need that huge sense of depth. We've already established that by this point in the track. So at this point during the outro, the listener's going to be focused mostly on texture and groove. So bring up that pad just a little bit, maybe sidechain it a little bit more heavily against the kick once you bring it up so that we maintain a good sense of pumping. All right, fantastic work though, Dan. Let's give it up for West Side Angel with My Tears. Just to kind of catch everyone up on the chat if you haven't been following along, it does unfortunately look like we are only allowed to use the stems for the purpose of the contest. So yeah, we're gonna have to hold off on track feedback for you, Jono. But best of luck on the contest itself. I'm a big Autograph fan, so, and this Love Runs Deep is a great track, so I might have to listen to this on my own time after the stream just to, see what you've got going on. But yeah, for the purposes of the stream, we do need to withhold. Thanks for understanding, everyone. Up next, I'm going to go ahead and move on forward. We've got a track submission from Sammy coming out of our Radio Ready program. Looking for feedback at around 40 seconds. Saying, hey guys, something I put together today for this chicane competition. I feel the track is a bit heavy on the low end. What type of strategies do we have to separate sounds? EQ, volume, compressing, moving it in the 3D space, saturation, changing the timbre. What am I missing? Thanks, you guys are the best. Cool. So I don't know anything about this competition. Same sort of thing that we just talked about with Jono, though. If it is a competition and it's a remix using previous stems, if you could just confirm for me in the chat that it is, good to go, then I can go ahead and give it a listen. Otherwise, again, we're going to have to, withhold on it. However, I will just, answer your question really quickly. So you're saying, what else can we do to separate sounds? The two main things that you're going to have are EQ and volume. And you can get 90% of the way down a good mix with just EQ and volume, right? These other tools like compressing, moving in 3D space, saturation, changing the timbre, those are sweetening effects, right? Like, if you were making a statue, that would be the equivalent of like painting the eyebrows on the statue. But the overall shape of creating the body, the arms, the head, the chest, the legs, 90% of that work is going to be relative to the volume and the EQ. The other biggest thing, you said mixing it in the 3D space, but yeah, really diving into that and using stereo separation and using frequency separation in the top to bottom range is going to be huge. Otherwise, you have a couple of other small tricks available to you, like you can use delay to help create a sense of distance and space. You can use chorus and phasers and flangers to help thin things out a little bit and create more separation. You can use comb filters to take out the body of certain elements. But again, those are all very small sweetening things. So I would say focus on really perfecting your EQ volume and then your stereo separation, and you should be in like a 95% completed mix at that point. I guess the one other thing that I haven't touched on is reverb. Use of reverb can help push things further back, or if you don't have, too much reverb on it and it's just a subtle amount with a lot of mid-range focus, you can actually help add body and thickness to a sound with that reverb. So hopefully that, gives you, a few good tips there, especially because I, can't provide feedback on the track. So good luck for you guys that are, submitting these, but hope you understand why we can't necessarily play them on the stream. All right, so up next, then, we'll get to a track from Mr. Gabriel Rodriguez coming out of our Accelerator program. Saying, hey, Neil, this is a new track that me and John Holland have been working on. For the feedback, we want to know the balance and relation between each elements and also the power of the synths in the last drop. Also, I was struggling with the sidechain on the kick and the bass. Hope you guys like the track and get ready to go back into the good old 90s. Awesome. Yeah, let's see what we got. With Gabriel and 90s Back in Time. All right, skip ahead a little bit. So I know that this is like still, a work in progress, but I would just say, you can probably start the track right here with a little bit of a quicker uptick. What you want to avoid is making sure anyone has to do what I just did, which was kind of skip ahead waiting to hear the audio properly, especially if they're in a noisy environment. They might think that this track is just silent if they, don't know to expect some sort of growth later on from you. Love the texture of this, pad layer that you've got going on. The top end of the percussion are just a little bit lost at this point, so it might be worth bringing them up a tiny bit in volume. And then if you notice they start to get a little too brittle in the high end, maybe just, shelving down the high end a little bit and then boosting up the mid-range of that percussion a little bit more would help. Let's get the head a little closer to the drop. Nice. Really good drum samples here. Check out the kick and bass relationship. You mentioned you were having trouble with the side chaining, but honestly, your kick and bass relationship sounds great, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. However, I did want that same degree of pulsing and pumping going on the pad layer to start the drop because it was taking away a little bit from our dynamic range in terms of space. These little chord synth stabs that are coming in on top. Fantastic texture, just a little bit too loud relative to the rest of the mix. One thing I would focus on is bringing up a little bit more of the upper mids of the bass. That's going to be such a driving feature of this track that we really want that to be nice and present. So on the synths, great atmosphere, great textures for the most part. I think that one main synth that just started out this section was a little bit too bright and airy, so I would just shelf down the high end of that a little bit to, help kind of match the more low-key vibe coming out of the drop.
And now Journey Back in Time. Let's do this. Let's do this. It's our gift from the universe.
All right, and let's check the power and the synths on that last drop really quickly. Well, same thing, it's just a little bit too bright and piercing, so just taking a high shelf and knocking some of that down. And then in contrast, using some mid-range coloring EQ to help add some more body and thickness across these synths would be a good move. I think the final thing I'm noticing is that these pads, the sustained pad layers, are getting to be a little bit too loud relative to the main synth lead. So I would knock those back, a few dB in volume. One final thing for you is I'd love that main lead synth you've got playing right now to be knocked down an octave. It's just a little bit too high up there. It sounds a tiny bit squeaky as a result. But if you knock that down an octave, it should be sitting really cleanly and sound a little bit fuller. All right. So let's see. Up next, we've got a track submission from Mr. Eric Melton coming out of our Accelerator program. He's saying, looking for general vibe feedback and vocal mixing. Does the instrumentation work? Yeah, let's see what we've got with C1.
You've been lost and alone in the city lights, I know. Getting hot, feeling low, and it's out of your control.
Great groove, great composition. This chord progression is lovely.
I won't leave you.
Vocals fitting nicely.
I'm never letting you go. You've been lost and alone in the city lights, I know. But I will guide you home.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to play this one more time since it was only 30 seconds. But some things to listen out for, and Eric, things to improve. So the vocal as a whole is sounding really nice, but I would like a little bit more low mid-range body on it with some coloring EQ. On top of that, I'd love a little bit more reverb on it to help thicken it up and fill out the space just a little bit further. Finally, on your synths, you have some nice separation going on between them, but I think we could create a fuller sound by either layering in one more set of synths that's really, really wide and maintains that same sense of body and power, or just taking your existing synths and spreading them out a little bit wider. Let's give that one more listen and see if anything else comes up.
You've been lost and alone in the city lights, I know.
So you have these like ad-libs in the vocals and stuff every once in a while. Spread those nice and wide too, just to create a little bit more separation between them and the main vocal.
You should know that I won't leave you. I'll stay beside you. I'm never letting you go. You've been lost and alone.
Finally, I think we have just a little bit of a gap of body in the synths, so one more like upper mid bass layer to help fill that out a little bit would help out. And this could be like a restyle bass, or it could be, you know, just a lower layer to your superstar chords. But you have a nice sub end, you have a nice octave just above the sub, but that like 150 to 400 hertz range isn't quite as full as I need it to be. So just one extra bass layer in there should help out. Really fantastic work with that composition, vibe, and groove, though, Eric. I am definitely looking forward to checking out the next iteration of this one. All right. Okay, so coming up next, we've got a track submission from Jace out of our Accelerator program as well. Then listen to the first 15 seconds or so to hear the intro synths, 52 to 120 to hear the first drop, 145 for the bridge, and 230 to hear the transition and last drop. Okay, yeah, let's skip around through here and see what we got, Jace. Nice start. No complaints with that intro. Percussion might have been just a tiny bit loud to start, but honestly, I'm kind of okay with it. It helps really set the energy for the rest of the track. I would just make sure, like, instead of cutting it out right away, it either goes out with some sort of, like, filter sweep or fill going on. 52 to 120 for the first drop. So I'm getting a little bit of mid-range buildup among our pads. I would just shelf down a little bit of like that probably 200 to 800 hertz range in the pad layer so that the arp-like layer can cut through a little bit more. And then the vocal needed a little bit more volume and side chaining on the pads against the vocal there. Cool groove, cool vibe there. I'm not quite getting the sub drive that I need on it. So a little bit more weight on the low end of the kick and then a little bit more weight on the sub end of the bass would be great. Well, this bridge is working really nicely. Again, I think just a little bit more saturation on the vocals to help thicken it up would be great. And then also on your bass line, a little bit more saturation to just help add some body, some extra drive and thickness to that. Okay, so right at this moment, the new clap that you've layered in there is just a little bit too late to hit. I'm getting just a tiny bit too much separation and flamminess between your two different like clap and snare layers that are going on. So tighten that up a little bit, and then it's also just a touch loud compared to everything else. So I would reduce that new layer a little bit as well. And then we'll just check out this last section. Yeah, everything there is working nicely. That siren's a nice touch as well. It's just a tiny bit too loud as well, so bring that back down. Awesome. Cool, so I think the biggest thing has to do with the levels of your various elements. Like I said, that snare just got to be a little bit too loud. We could use a little bit more coming from the vocal, coming from the bass line, and then from the sub end of the mix. All right, well, great work there, Jace. Up next, we've got a track submission from Mr. Tim Eads coming out of our Radio Ready program, saying, just general, still a work in progress. It has taken me the last 30 minutes to find a vocal compression plugin that was causing a massive pop when rendered. Had to bypass it, so the balance on the vocal is worse now. Just want to see how the feel of it sits with everyone. Thank you. Yeah, Tim, let's see what we got going on here. One thing I'd focus on to start, Tim, is just more stereo separation among your synth and instrument layers to start the track. Cool. There's just a tiny bit of tonal buildup between like the thicker electric piano-like sound and that brighter aerial one off to the left. So it might be worth just shelving down a little bit of the mid-range of this low-mid chord layer. I think it's taking up a tiny bit too much body and too much space in the mix. Contrast, I actually think the drums are a little too quiet, so I'd bring those drums up a decent amount with some extra high-end coloring EQ, maybe just a little bit of extra saturation on the drums as well. Alright, and I will say that actually is exclusive to the pre-drop because now the drums sound great. In terms of the vocal, I think it's actually sitting pretty nicely in the mix. It does have a little bit too much mid-range information to it. You'll probably see that boost or that peak at around like 1200 to 1400 hertz. And just shelving down or multiband compressing that vocal a little bit in that range will help. Past that, I would also add some extra fresh air to bring out some extra eeriness. Awesome. Let's pause. Cool. All right. Well, that takes care of it for this week's set of submissions. Let's give it up for Tim and everyone else who had a track in here. Thanks as always, everyone, for tuning in, for taking part in the chat. Once again, fantastic vibe, fantastic groove, and really great work on all of the tracks from everyone who submitted. For those of you, again, watching and who have been kind of new to the stream, if you are interested in getting feedback on your tracks, all you need to do is be enrolled in the Radio Ready program or the EDM Tips Accelerator. Like I said earlier, there's a link in the description below to learn more about that and set up a completely free, obligation-free welcome call where you can get to talk to one of us at EDM Tips and see if it truly is a good fit for you. We're always looking to bring more folks in. We've been seeing a ton of successes recently. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen it in the EDM Tips Academy group. Of folks getting signed to labels for the first time, working with new managers, having their tracks played out on massive radio shows. We're always looking to grow that and just help you guys improve further and further. So, like I said, if you're interested in any of that, please do feel free to check out that link below or reach out to any of us at EDM Tips, and we'd be happy to chat with you more about it. With that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thanks once again for tuning in, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful week ahead. Catch you guys next week for the next tune.